So I just want to thank everyone for coming out. We appreciate it. My presentation is about the reconstruction. Here from 1865 to 1877. Here reiterating the South of the Union, preparing the damage of the war, addressing the question of the rights of new free people who were formerly enslaved. So here's my central question. What is Reconstruction? What's the Reconstruction period after Civil War success and for who? First, we'd like to just not. Perhaps the historical event is decisive more than the Reconstruction period that has been pushed out of the big picture of the American story. My interest in Reconstruction was born after watching a documentary last year of the Civil War at home with my parents. The documentary concluded with the end of the Civil War in 1865 and left me with more questions than answers. What was the significance of the whole thing? Who benefited? Who did not? African Americans were pushed to the side during this era, and their respect for Reconstruction would be significantly different than that of white Americans. This knowledge changed everything for me. Winston Churchill said it best. Winston Churchill said it best. History is written by the victors. The more I took it, the more I realized how true this was. Many view Reconstruction as a success for civil rights movements. A slavery formally ended. However, the honest truth is much harder to digest. And learning about the way many white Americans, particularly white Southerners, treated African Americans during this time, forces you to confront a much more uncomfortable and painful truth. I became interested in learning the real story about what happened during African the not so glamorous reality of American history. First, understanding the government's point of view. The racist doubt is in the introspect of ruining African American information, and if left alone with that regulation, would be detrimental to everything the war fought over since the Emancipation Proclamation. Black Americans were in the war spot of the Civil War. The federal government stepped into great reforms to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau, and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 provided necessary military regulations, dividing it into 5 military districts, requiring states to ratify the 14th Amendment, an amendment that gave birthright citizenship, equal protection, and due process to all. African Americans even started to hold positions in political offices, with 600 state governments now having positions being held by Black Americans, a far cry from where they were a decade earlier, and they're just considered property. However, with the rise of Reformation came the rise of racism in the South. The more empowered African Americans got, the more threatened many Southerners felt, and the more white supremacy groups grew. The government's efforts for reform first took a turn for the worse after the Enforcement Acts in the early 1870s. A set of acts intended to shut down the white violent supremacist groups in the South, most significantly the KKK. But after the Enforcement Acts, the federal government was less interested in focusing on Reconstruction. With scandals surrounding President Grant, Democrats began to win more elections and grew more powerful in Congress. The shift of power pulled federal attention away from defending Black Americans in southern areas and more focused on areas that benefited them. This was a real hit for African Americans, referred to as the Compromise of 1877, which pulled troops out of the South and ended Reconstruction once and for all, and fully gave them the power to go back into Southern governments. The Southern governments pulled Black Americans out of political office positions, gave them harsher sentences than whites before the courts, and allowed local governments to enact loopholes to the 15th Amendment through literacy tests, which were absurdly unfair. In addition, they instituted property qualifications, which were a set of laws that required Black Americans to own property and vote, knowing full well that many of them did not own land. Violating the Reformation set in place by the federal government, with no federal regulation to stop them, left Black Americans powerless under Southern governments, and ultimately put them in the same position as they were prior to the war. Black Americans suffered while Southerners were pleased with the arrangement of free government. While African Americans were free, they were disenfranchised with no money or career. 40 acres of mule was a federal plan proposed by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman in January 1865. It promised land and resources given to Black Americans to give them the opportunity to earn money to economically establish themselves as free. However, after President Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, President Johnson canceled the plan, returning nearly 400,000 acres of land back to Confederate owners and left Black Americans in an economically vulnerable position. Only 4% of freedmen worked in cities after the war. With agricultural as the only option, many of them were forced to get into sharecropping as a career. Sharecropping was a system in which a person would work for a landowner, and in exchange for their work, they would receive a percentage of the harvest, farming equipment, and 20 to 50 acres of land and housing. Many of these landowners were supporters or even ex-Confederates themselves, and sought revenge on African Americans for their loss in the war. The Freedmen's Bureau, enacted that was passed a few years earlier, was put in place partly to ensure that sharecropping would remain fair. But in 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was abolished, leaving Southern landowners with the power to run their land however they wanted. Sharecroppers were faced with high livestock, conditions that mimicked slavery, and the sense of being tied to the landowner. As a result, Southern Black Americans fell into major poverty as they struggled to pay for the simplest items such as food and clothing. The so-called benefits meant little to them, and the long grueling hours of backbreaking work were reminiscent of their days as slaves. Black sharecropper Ed Brown said in testimony that it was hard work that got them nowhere. The punishments they faced were also horrific. If they escaped, they could be imprisoned or even shot to death by the landowner. Even what the South was doing was considered unconstitutional. Southern leaders who were still seeking revenge enforced their own laws as the federal government was politically exhausted, turned a blind eye to it, leaving Black Americans at the mercy of racist Southern leaders. African Americans began to face extreme racial discrimination in the South as well. The KKK and other white supremacist groups continued to gain power. By 1877, when the federal troops were pulled out of the South, reforms quickly became dismantled by the KKK. They vandalized black schools, lynched and tortured African Americans, and forced African American families off their legally owned land through violence and terror. Some KKK members even held seats in Southern governments and permitted racial violence. They limited African Americans from utilizing their right to vote through requiring literacy tests and property qualifications, like I said before. But the KKK used violence and terror tactics to scare African Americans away from voting. The Jim Crow laws also became another form of control over African Americans. These laws created separate spaces for Black and white Americans in public areas, restaurants, theaters, schools, hospitals, buses, and trains are just a few places that became segregated. The Plessy vs. Ferguson Supreme Court case determined that segregation was illegal as long as the facilities themselves were equal, but the Southern government built white facilities that were drastically better than black facilities, leaving them far from equal. Frederick Douglass wrote a letter to an unknown individual saying that the quality of education during the Jim Crow laws was worse than the education white Americans were receiving. He expressed that the black community continued to feel that whites held mastery over them, leading many to believe they still felt like property. The KKK and Jim Crow laws were lost for decades. Reconstruction failed to address the systematic issues of hate and racism. Because of these deep-rooted problems, Reconstruction left African Americans subject to discrimination and oppression. So what? Reconstruction was a success for white Southerners who were cemented racism. But it was not a success for the millions of African Americans who were recently freed. The injustices rooted in Reconstruction would continue for an immense amount of time. African Americans continued to largely remain in poverty, vulnerable to racial violence, and forced to use separate facilities than whites. Southern whites continued to enjoy being on the victorious side of Reconstruction, having the power to leave black Americans subject to them and maintain the societal reputation as being superior to African Americans. So why is it even necessary to reflect on a time so long ago? Because we are a nation built on mistakes. As Americans, we have the amazing freedom to change narrative, pivot, and create a better future. Our history books teach us about George Washington's crossing the Delaware, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Yorktown, and countless other successes. They don't create this amazing country. These successes deserve all the recognition and credit they can give. However, we can't gloss over the ugly and uncomfortable parts. The parts of the story where some of the consequences are still being untangled today. Many Americans think they are informed when it comes to racial civil rights in this country. The narrative that slavery existed and we fought over it to end it. This neat narrative tied up in a perfect bow is anything but perfect. Unearthing the horrors of the past is the first step towards a better future. Disappointments like Reconstruction actually hold extensive value and help us see what not to do. As wise philosopher George Santayana once said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I'll open it up now to questions.
Firstly, thank you for that awesome research and your presentation, and also just the way you notice that was really powerful just now. And kind of in the spirit of the posing question, I was wondering, oftentimes in policies, there's different visions originally, and then one is carried out, and other visions of the reconstruction in this case are not. Do you do any research into alternative visions of reconstruction and why this specific one won out? Because the reason I'm wondering that is, are there contemporary parallels in terms of how we legislate and how we think about policies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did a little research on President Lincoln. He was assassinated, 5 days after the war ended. We all know the Gettysburg Address, talking about a new birth of freedom, stuff like that. He did set forth a plan. I think it was a few months before Reconstruction ended, maybe it was a year before, kind of about how to kind of go about it. It mostly focused on just readmitting the South to the Union, but if you kind of look closely at some of his documents, you kind of can see some proof of more sort of effective ways of civil rights. Because he was his whole life he was kind of an anti-slavery person, and obviously he was assassinated, and his President Johnson took over. So I thought that was interesting. The kind of what if question, what if that didn't happen, and what if he was in office? Maybe there would have been a different outcome. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was something I found.
How do you see the effects of Reconstruction?
It's an excellent question, yeah. Very deep question. I think I try to listen and pay attention to as many perspectives as I can, in my life. I'm not exactly, I guess, for lack of a better term, diverse as a white male, so I don't have a perspective that a lot of people have, but I listen to everyone I can. I think obviously there's still, in many facets, there's discrimination today. And I think kind of one area that society is lacking, kind of what I was hinting at before, is the idea of listening and learning about different people and different, with different backgrounds, because I think that's kind of how you grow as a person. So I think kind of with the kind of discrimination that's present today, I'd like to see kind of people get out of their kind of little realm and expose themselves to all different kinds of people and learn and grow.
Thank you for this presentation. I really value your closing, right? And how you said that the history is something that sits in the past, and I really appreciate how you really made this relevant to what we talked about today. One of the questions I had was around sharecropping. And I speak from the fact that my family, they were sharecroppers, right? So, they were doing. So I was wondering how much you've done into sharecropping and its economic impact on those states that then lost their free labor and have to substitute for almost free labor, right? So I was curious how much of that being
Yeah.
into your labor.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, and even I didn't put it in here, but I think southern governments even sort of enacted laws that they knew were going to make it difficult for sharecroppers to sell the crop and make less money. And so it just, you know, obviously the deep-rooted racism, like I was talking about before. But it's just, and you know, like I said, for violation, there was punishments of involuntary servitude or even death. And I was amazed on how much this is sort of ignored, because if you read closely, like I read a few primary sources, it really is just kind of the same as slavery. So, you know, we think that slavery ended in, you know, 1863, but I think there's a longer lasting version of that, and to me, that was just something very surprising.
Do you remember the Civil War documentary that you watched that inspired?
Yeah, it was Abraham Lincoln on the History Channel with Graham Shipley.
Hello everyone, thank you for attending our Scholars presentations today. My name is Sadie, and my project is Fashion and Change in the 50s, how post-war America and European designers redefined women's fashion. The essential question that I attempted to answer is what shaped 1950s fashion in America? My thesis is the fashion of 1950s American women was shaped by the post-war culture of the country, specifically the focus on the suburban lifestyle, and the influence of European designers, namely Balenciaga, Givenchy, and Dior. In the 1950s, America was in a transition out of the time before, after the involvement in World War II. The 1950s was host to a tremendous growth in the middle-class Americans who lived comfortably. With this comfortability came an increase in consumer culture, as people were able to spend excess money on things from clothes to home appliances. There was a mass movement to suburbia of those wanting to fulfill the desire of having the perfect house, with a white picket fence, a TV in their living room, and a car in their driveway. Families grew as soldiers returned home who were eager for the stability of family and living out the American dream. This also meant that women were to assume the role of housewives. They were expected to care for their children, to cook every meal, and to keep the house spotless. And on top of this, if they were not dressed to the nines while performing these daily tasks, they were frowned upon. As you can see from the photos above, their attire consisted of dresses with cinched waistlines and full skirts. Some decided to wear belted dresses or gold collars, but all had to be within reason because they had to be functional. We'll come back to some of these photos later because there was a clear friendship between the attire of American housewives and the designs from top couture designers in Europe. Of course, the details differed. The overall A-line silhouette stayed consistent throughout the classes and the countries. This obsession with fashion that consumed women frustrated them. They often called women sheets of fashion, believing all they did was follow the trends of other women and whatever was coming out of Paris. However, men were criticized at this point because if anyone was sheets of fashion, it was them. Women accepted the change of style from the switch in the 1940s of an overly utilitarian look to an overly feminine style in the 1950s. Men never changed. As the Vogue editor-in-chief at the time, Ed Chase explained, if a man was wearing the same outfit that he wore in the 1920s and the 50s, no one would bat an eye. But if a woman was dressed in a popular dress in the 20s and 50s, it would turn heads because she would seem out of place. All to say, the 1950s was a period of change, a change in which women across the world accepted and adopted into their wardrobes. It's also important to note that the post-war period brought a fear of communism upon Americans that was worsened by their leaders. People were hyper-aware of possible influences of communism in their daily lives, including in fashion. They never took inspiration from communist countries, like, for example, the Soviet Union. They actually did the opposite and competed with them. In the late 1950s, in the midst of the race to space and Americans trying to separate themselves from communism, America competed in a competition style against the Soviet Union as part of the American National Exhibition. American regular citizens, model and models alike, presented a fashion show in Moscow in 1959. Their goal was to showcase the sophisticated American style from everyday wear to evening gowns. They successfully did so and did seem to prove a dominance over the Soviet Union fashion due to their effortlessly elegant attire. This fashion exhibition was one of my favorite discoveries in the project because it truly shows how fashion is intertwined with history but often overlooked. Now we're going to look at the influence of European designers. For those of you who don't know, the 1950s is often called the golden age of haute couture due to the abundant number of couture houses that opened in the 50s. I focused on the works of three main houses: Balenciaga, Givenchy, and Dior. Cristobal Balenciaga was born in Spain in 1895, but moved to Paris and opened his haute couture house in 1937. While he did have success in the 40s, his real fame came in the 50s. His designs were heavily influenced by his Spanish heritage that focused on an architectural look, with unique shoulders, standout skirts, and accentuated hips. He also had collections that were described as cloud-like, like, for example, the balloon dress that was released in 1951. It's pictured above. Due to these designs, such as these, Balenciaga was nicknamed the king of fashion. And while he didn't inspire the fashion community as a whole, he also particularly inspired one person, and his name was Roberto Givenchy. Givenchy opened his house at just 24 years old after years of admiring the great Balenciaga. Givenchy is often associated with extra elegance due to his other muse, Audrey Hepburn. Givenchy gained an audience that suggests Hepburn in her personal life and in big-time films like Breakfast at Tiffany's. Now, there's no possible way to talk about 1950s fashion and not mention Christian Dior. Dior opened his fashion house in Paris in 1946 and released his first collection in February of 1947. His collection was quickly named the New Look by Harper's Bazaar. His collection defined much of the 1950s style from Europe to across the Atlantic in America. At first, women just viewed it as going back to the old ways of wearing corsets and trying to craft an artificial silhouette. They didn't want to wear the same things that their grandmothers had worn. However, after close examination, it was clear that there was more creativity on these 17 and under waists. Many countries had just come out of a time of war with very masculine and utilitarian fashion. The few styles that attempted to branch out often still had uniform-like silhouettes. Fabrics were also scarce during times of war, which meant little to no frills and no details on any designs. When the late 1940s and 50s arrived, consumers were ready to embrace extravagant, unconventional, and overly feminine styles. Dior exemplified these new styles with soft necklines, big fur coats, belted dresses, lace fabrics, cinched waistlines, voluminous skirts, and an overall A-line shape. The small waists weren't just they were a fashion statement. The question now becomes, where did post-war American society and European designers overlap? First of all, many American designers went over to Paris for interning. For example, American designer James Gavanos interned for Robert Piguet in Paris in the 1940s. Dior also interned for Piguet just years before. This meant that the basis of training of Gavanos and Dior was very similar, which sometimes was visible in their designs. For example, in the photos above, it's clear that Gavanos, Dior, and Piguet's designs share a focus on a similar structure. You can also see how this structure is very similar to the attire worn by American housewives. Vogue magazine was also a huge force in bringing styles over to America. Journalists would make the long haul over to Europe to go attend Paris fashion weeks and report back with the hottest trends. With their spare change, women would purchase copies of Vogue and be fascinated with the looks that came straight from the runway. Women also loved Vogue because it featured some of their favorite celebrities whom they turned to for fashion advice. The 1950s was host to the rise of Hollywood stardom. Audrey Hepburn was a fan favorite because she carried herself with such poise and elegance that she was simply hard to resist. She starred in movies such as Breakfast at Tiffany's and My Fair Lady, which held popularized items like the little black dress. And as I mentioned earlier, she was rarely seen without a Da Vinci design on. A similar figure was Grace Kelly, who starred in films such as The High Society. Her style became even more admirable when she became a real-life princess in 1956 when she married Prince Rainier of Monaco. She wore designs from the big three, Balenciaga, Da Vinci, and Dior. The new look fit perfectly into her style, along with her hats, her white gloves, and her tailored jackets. Marilyn Monroe was much different from Hepburn and Kelly, as she was viewed as the ultimate blonde movie queen of her era. The appeal of Monroe's style was her confidence and playfulness as she sported pencil skirts and halter dresses, all of which stemmed from the new designs created in Europe. The thing is, fashion is never shaped by one idea or one thing. Just the post-war society did not have created the golden age of haute couture that is the 1950s, but it was needed to create an environment that was able to adapt to the looks created by European designers. This is exactly why I wanted to do this project. I've always had a love for fashion, not only because of the creativity of it, but also because there are so many factors that affect the way we choose to present ourselves. This project was also helpful in making connections to the way we choose to present ourselves today. I often hear fashion lovers express a concern that the rise of social media is killing our originality style. But guess what? Society has always been composed of trend followers. The only thing that has changed is the method and speed at which trends are spread. We all adapt the current trends to our own taste in one way or another. That is what creates originality. American housewives adapted Dior's new look by switching the patterns to fit their taste and making the cut of the dresses functional for their lifestyle. Similar to how I adapted a trend I saw on TikTok to fit within the Williston dress code and appeal to my grade bag. But even below that, there's a sequence of events which affects each stylistic decision. World War II, a woman's husband, where a European designer was trained, what state a woman lived in, what magazine she chose to buy, and who her social group was, could all affect what one woman decided to wear on an autumn day in 1957. Just like how where I was raised, the TikTok algorithm, my choice to come to boarding school, the political climate of our government, having an older sister, and growing up a dancer all affect my one choice of what to wear today. Thank you. Any questions?
I'm wondering if research into fast fashion and the way that clothes are disposed of today.
Yeah, so kind of something that I didn't really talk much about here is kind of that increase in like consumer culture, which also meant that the 1950s was like when mass production really started. A reason that I think like you can see how like a lot of the structures are very similar, but the attire that American housewives were wearing was not things that came straight from Dior. And part of it was expensive, but also part of it was the designs that were from these top couture houses couldn't be recreated in a mass production sort of way to be available to the public. And so I think it kind of made me think about like, kind of it's similar today, you see something on, the runway and it's adapted right to fast fashion, whether it's at Zara or H&M or whatever store it is. So I think that's kind of something I didn't talk about much, but I think it really did start in the 50s is when that whole fast fashion really started.
Accept
Well, I think it really depends. I think lifestyle is a huge part of it. Like I was saying, like, even though it may seem crazy, like, or funny that, like, oh, I'm adapting something to fit within a dress code, like, it's true. People, I think people are okay with this. I'm trying to figure out, like, you mean, like, the difference between. Okay. I think that kind of people like Dior and people like Da Vinci and Balenciaga, they all everyone just put up a time of war with this super uniform-like style and, like, can even, like, everything that they wore was very minimal. And I think they kind of set the stage for something that, like, you don't have to follow the status quo with it. And I think designers even today, like, that's kind of the reason, like, we have diversity is because of all of these different runways, like, watching New York Fashion Week, you're not watching the same thing walk down the runway. Like in this, like, it's not even a great example of it, but, like, a lot of Dior's designs were just insanely huge skirts with lots of frills and layers and nothing like what they'd worn in the previous decade. And I think it just shows, like, he kind of was, like, going against the status quo and saying, no, you can break out of that, you don't have to follow whatever is, relevant at the moment. Well, I think, I mentioned earlier, functionality. They had this weird kind of polar opposite sides of what they had to be. They had to, do everything for the household, be the person who, cleaned the house, who made the meals, who took care of the children, and never went into work, and was simply just, kind of confined to working just at home. And I think they were almost kind of shut down because the 1940s is when a lot of soldiers went off to war so women could go into the workforce. And then when they came back from war, it was like, oh, never mind, like, go back. And so I think they kind of turned their attention to fashion because they needed to find an outlet for something. They needed to find this expression somewhere that wasn't having the job that they felt empowered by. If someone were to wear something that was popular in the early 2000s, like for men was to wear something popular in the early 2000s today, I don't think people would think much differently of it. I think there's obviously, there's exceptions. I think people have gotten more comfortable with expressing kind of a different side. But I also think that when men kind of stand out in the way they dress, they're often viewed as more feminine, which I think goes to say something. Not that I overly researched that, but I think that definitely makes a statement on, like, you see a man who you think is well dressed, and you're like, oh, he looks so good, and someone else is like, oh, he's just dressing really feminine. That's not always true. I think there are definitely exceptions to that, but it's just kind of the way society is shaped. But I think that can change.
Thank you all for being here today. My project focuses on a government agency called the National Endowment for the Humanities, better known as the NEH. My essential question for this project is, how has America's changing political landscape affected the NEH over its 60-year history? To answer this question, I examined the NEH in the context of its founding in 1965, the NEH in relation to President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society and the Culture Wars, and the NEH today. Throughout its history, the NEH has received accolades, but also an abundance of criticism, and some have expressed doubts as to whether it should exist at all. Today, the NEH is once again at risk, as this year, the current presidential administration revoked much of the almost $75 million in grants that the NEH awarded just months earlier during Biden's presidency. At this point, you might be wondering why I'm interested in this random government agency. That's a very good question. My interest in the NEH stems from its direct impact on me and my family. In December of 2024, my mother received a 6-month fellowship for a book project from the NEH, only to have the funds withdrawn in April of 2025. The way that my mother's funding was terminated, as was the funding of many other NEH award recipients, raised legal concerns and eliminated the role of politics in grant making. I argue that not only does the history of the NEH provide a lens through which political currents can be seen, but the NEH's history also reveals the powerful influence of politics on cultural values. To offer some context for my project, I'd like to first provide you with an understanding of what the humanities are. Research in the humanities includes the study of human beings, human expression, and culture, and encompasses disciplines such as language, literature, history, and philosophy, among others. Some projects in the humanities can even receive funding from the government through NEH grants. Grants are sums of money given to both organizations and individuals by funders like corporations, foundations, or in the case of the NEH, government agencies. Scholars in the humanities can apply for NEH grants by submitting project proposals, which are subject to rigorous peer reviews by researchers in the field before being evaluated by NEH staff members. Ultimately, based on their merits, these projects are deemed worthy or not worthy of receiving government funding. In September of 1965, Congress passed legislation to establish the National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities, which was then signed into law by President Johnson. The National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities is comprised of 2 endowments, the NEH and the National Endowment for the Arts, or the NEA. In this legislation statement of purpose, Congress claimed that, quote, a high civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other great branches of man's scholarly and cultural activity. And that, quote, democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens, and that it must therefore foster and support a form of education designed to make men masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. The NEH has funded projects ranging from Ken Burns' 1990 documentary, The Civil War, which received over $1 million in governmental support, to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, to research on artificial intelligence and many other issues related to democracy, culture, and society. From its founding until the present day, the NEH has given out a total of over $6 billion in federal funding. The founding of the NEH was spurred by President Johnson's Great Society. The Great Society was a term that Johnson used to describe the programs and legislation that he put in place from 1964 to 1968, aimed at reducing poverty, advancing civil rights, and improving quality of life. In a speech at the University of Michigan in 1964, Johnson said that, quote, the Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. President Johnson believed that promoting the humanities and arts was a necessary step towards improving the quality of life for all Americans. The kind of culture that President Johnson sought to promote was democratic and inclusive, one that valued equal opportunity, education, and access to knowledge for everyone, regardless of their background. Johnson's Great Society built on the political and social changes instituted in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s with a renewed focus on culture and knowledge. The legislation that he signed into law declared that the arts and humanities belong to all people. That quote, the arts and humanities belong to all people in the United States. Before the 20th century, the federal government was hesitant to fund cultural initiatives, and when it did, such efforts were driven more by civic and economic goals than a desire to support culture itself. For instance, throughout America's early history and into the late 1800s, political leaders repeatedly tried and failed to create a national university. The idea behind creating a national university was to cultivate citizens whose values reflected the ideals of the American Republic. Although the NEH differs in many ways from what a national university might look like, the sentiment is the same: a nationwide governmental promotion of American culture and ideals. These values were held across political parties in the 1960s, which is what allowed the NEH to be founded. However, given its status as a governmental agency, the NEH is an inherently political institution, for better and for worse, as is demonstrated by the following example. The 1960s and early 1970s were a period of growth and consolidation for the NEH, which, at the time had broad bipartisan support. However, from the late 1970s through the 1990s, as a result of what came to be known as the culture wars, there were repeated efforts to privatize the NEH and even attempts to fund the agency entirely. These efforts amounted to a struggle between conservative Republican politicians who argued that the NEH should focus solely on projects that were more traditional and based in the Western canon, and more progressive Democratic groups arguing that the NEH should fund a broad range of projects representative of the diversity of the nation. Fundamentally, this was an argument about what kinds of humanities research the government should fund. This argument was tied to the leadership of the agency and was deeply politicized as a result. In the 1990s, former NEH chairs William Bennett and Lynn Cheney, who served under the Reagan and Bush administrations, argued that the agency itself should be terminated rather than funding projects they deemed as political. From the late 1990s through the 2010s, the NEH survived despite changes in the priorities espoused by subsequent presidential administrations. However, under Trump's second term, the NEH, like many other federal agencies, has come under attack. In March of this year, the chair of the NEH, Shelley C. Lowe, resigned under pressure from President Trump. In April, acting chair Michael McDonald sent letters to state humanities councils, as well as individual grant recipients, telling them their funding was terminated and that the agency would be, quote, repurposing its funding allocations in furtherance of the president's agenda. Additionally, McDonald noted that the grant terminations were necessary in order to, quote, safeguard the interests of the federal government, including its fiscal priorities. This means that more than 85% of the current grants were canceled, with seemingly little attention paid to the subject matter of the funded projects. My mother's termination letter, which she received on April 3rd, 2025, cited 4 of President Trump's executive orders, including commencing the reduction of the federal bureaucracy, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing, ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling, and defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. My mother's project, entitled Reading for Pleasure, Working Women, the Popular Romance of Early 20th Century Britain, has literally nothing to do with the first 3 of these executive orders, and the only relevance that it has to the 4th is that they both pertain to women. Even if her project did have any relevance to these executive orders, the abrupt termination of grants that had already gone through the peer review process and had been approved by the NEH staff raises serious questions about the legal grounds for such cancellations. Specifically, the terminations raised questions about possible violations of the First Amendment right to freedom of speech, among other concerns. In the intervening months since the grants were canceled, the Authors Guild and several professional organizations have brought lawsuits on behalf of grantees. Although the Authors Guild won a major victory in the Southern District Court of New York on these First Amendment grounds in July, it is still unclear whether fellowship recipients will actually receive the funds that they were promised. The case still needs to go to the Court of Federal Claims for the money to be distributed to grant recipients. Meanwhile, the NEH recently announced $34.8 million of new grants focused on patriotic themes and related to presidents, statesmen, and canonical authors. Another example of the more conservative views espoused by the current Republican administration. In conclusion, America's changing political landscape has affected the NEH in 2 ways, positively and negatively. America's political landscape in 1965 had a positive impact on the NEH because it allowed for its creation, providing a means through which to rise to President Johnson's call for promotion of the humanities. However, the changing political landscape has also had a negative impact on the NEH because both historically and in the present day, the agency has been used by its leaders to push their own ideas about not only which projects should be funded, but moreover, what values should be represented in American culture. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, really fascinating and alarming. I have a lot of questions. I mean, I guess hopefully it's a personal one, but what is the status of her mom's school? What happened?
Well, she's actually in the crowd today. But she's still working on it. It did not get the government funding. She will still be able to publish it, but obviously, that's work that's now being unpaid, so that's obviously challenging. Yeah.
So, during, you talked about the culture wars in the 60s and 70s. Did they ever terminate grants
Yes.
Or stuff, person stuff?
Actually, so the culture wars were mostly from, the culture wars that I talked about in this were mostly from the 70s to the 90s. And during that time, they did turn in black grants. In the 60s and 70s, those kind of the best off the age has been, and proportionally is when they received the most government funding to develop the projects. So that's kind of a golden age for them. There were definitely still doubts as to whether it should exist or not back then, but it's more so now. It's a lot bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo Dr. R's comments about this being blending and learning all at the same time. I would be curious to hear from your perspective what role grants like this play in knowledge acquisition, right? Why do grants matter for people like your mom who are creating knowledge? What is the impact of grants? And why they matter as we're trying to kind of promote the humanities? What's their importance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of what the NEH stands for is promoting diverse works. I think that, especially with the Biden administration, when they were giving out NEH grants, there's a much more diverse theme than just patriotic projects. So I think grants really contribute to diversity of knowledge in general and the promotion of culture in the U.S. across all fields, rather than just that one patriotic. All right.
Hi everyone, I appreciate everyone taking time to be here today. I'm going to be diving into the history of digital entertainment and the effects that it has on teenagers, starting from the television in the 1950s to on-demand movies and shows in the late 2000s, and finally social media in the last decade. So I chose to investigate the evolution of digital entertainment because I've recently become more interested in social media and its effects on both my peers and myself. I started recognizing negative habits and attempted to change them, and realized a huge loss of time to mindless scrolling and binging shows. Not only that, but I also saw a decline in my own social connection to friends. Time spent with them did not necessarily decline, but the quality of the time did. This led me to investigate the source of the screen, the television. I took this information as far back as I could to explore why people started questioning the television and screens, so I made a scholars project. During my presentation, I will be exploring this essential question. How has digital entertainment changed over time, and how has it impacted teenagers' lives? Well, starting in the 1950s, regular televisions were introduced to the public. After World War II had ended, there was a widespread adoption of television in American homes. Starting slow, with only 9% of American households owning a set in the year 1950, a whopping 90% owned one in 1960. It was not until this deep integration of television that psychologists started to examine the effects that television had on behavior, with many positive and many negative. Even if it's simple things, the television was advertised as a useful tool to have in the household. As shown in the ad above, televisions offer peace, quiet, and no more rainy day riots, keeping small fry out of mischief and out of mother's hair. And that's just one of many TV blessings. Taking away television from children who act up is a punishment that really works. Rights of authority on child psychology. Well, the child who might have been playing with the things that they weren't supposed to, or were craving parental attention that just could not be given, is now taken care of. Right? Sit them in front of the growing screen and they're not going to want anything more. Alright, so many do not realize that the same machine that adds so much to life and can be useful in so many different ways, is also creating problems that won't make our lives much in the future. So the way that our eyes interact with television makes us become this sort of trance. The television shows us the entire scene, right? But if we were actually inside of that scene, it'd be much harder to look at what's all around us, right? Our peripheral vision is not as strong as our main vision, the focal vision, which is what we can use to sharply focus on something with. But being able to focus on the entirety of the scene on the television makes us forget about our real surroundings. An author writing on the negative effects of the television says that it causes the participant to blot out the real world and to enter into a pleasurable and passive mental state. Teenagers can get sucked into this ideal world and just forget about the life they're actually living in. A heavy television viewer says that, quote, "When the set is on, I cannot ignore it. I can't turn it off. I feel sapped, willless. As I reach out to turn off the set, the strength goes out of my arms, so I sit there for hours and hours." In the 1970s, they were already feeling television's effects. These issues are not only shown in television, but also in other more advanced forms of digital media, such as on-demand viewing. In 2007, there was a big shift in how teenagers consume movies and TV shows. Now, instead of being bound to specific cable times and channels showing a limited amount of movies or shows, anyone can watch what they want, when they want, drastically changing the freedom teenagers have in their viewing choices. It doesn't seem all that bad, right? Because it just made viewing more convenient. Well, given the choice of watching that show that you just started in love, or doing something else that you find enjoyable, but takes effort to enjoy, most would rather do something that takes the least amount of effort to get similar enjoyment. An author writing about Netflix and digital media trends says that, quote, "Whatever our televisual drug of choice, we've all put off errands at bedtime just to watch one more, a thrilling, draining, dream-influencing, and immersive experience that has become the standard way to consume certain TV programs." Just like the television, we are addicted to the sensations received from rapid, colorful, vivid images that come from the big low rectangle. Now, Netflix is who I hold accountable. Having started the trend of subscription video on-demand services, Netflix changed a big part of digital consumption by allowing the viewer to be in control. While researching the huge company, many sources I looked at said that Netflix owns binge watching. There was even the phrase "the Netflix effect" used to talk about a movie or show that became popular overnight on the Apple site. This was also new because their recommendation algorithms had been improved, really changing the game from something casual into something much more personalized. Overall, Netflix is not revolutionary. It has not only revolutionized the way we watch movies and TV shows, but also had a profound impact on the entire entertainment industry. Alright, so in 2007, there was also the invention of the iPhone. Social media and subscription video on-demand services became popular at similar times, but social media had some new features that teenagers had to figure out. Short-form content, stories, posts, reels, and For You pages. All the things that make social media unique, and what has a huge impact on adolescents. This new media was where digital entertainment really branched out. Social media has its roots in television, but is full of new ways to interact with the screen, like shorter videos and always being able to see what friends are doing. I found Instagram stories and posts have a huge impact on adolescents and the quality of their social connections. As far as stories, the intention was to allow each user to effortlessly share moments with all their friends. This was and still is the purpose, but the way that stories are used has transformed because of the following teens have on Instagram. Right? There's a very high number of accounts followed and means a lot of stories. They have become a method of passing time when teens will even watch stories that they're not actually interested in, but do anyway because it's something to do, a way to be entertained. Stories also contribute to the growth of FOMO, or fear of missing out. When on Instagram, engaging with content that friends might have posted, many teenagers can see their friends hanging out without them. Now they are influenced by other shared experiences, making them feel separated. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt notes that even with what seems to be good intention, quote, spending time on social media can still be harmful because of the chronic social comparison, the unachievable beauty standards, and the enormous amount of time taken away from everything else in life. Social media promises social connection, but often leaves the average teenager longing for it after being online. In addition, Height also says that, quote, smartphones are a second kind of experience blocker. Once they enter a child's life, they push out and reduce all other forms of non-phone-based experience, which is the kind of experience expected to create most need. Talking to friends, walking in nature, or anything that requires your attention is impacted the moment that you reach for your phone. Social media is a shift in digital entertainment because it more controls users, different from when they were controlling their own use with on-demand television. Okay, so what does it all mean, right? Why should we care? Well, if you recall my essential question, I've already gone through the evolution, but how about the impact? My answer is that all three of these mediums have led to a decline in teenagers' skills to create and innovate. For televisions, experts, quote, suspect that television deters the development of imaginative capacity insofar as it preempts time for spontaneous play. Experience has shown that children who cease watching television do play in ways clearly suggesting the use of an active imaginary world. Resuming their viewing, the children decrease this kind of play. While there's no direct way to prove that subscription video on demand impacts teenagers' creativity, it does have similar behavioral effects as televisions and social media, which we know do hinder innovation in teens. As said before, social media takes away from time spent on the things that might have been more fulfilling than reels or stories. A teacher who sees creativity as a critical issue in her career says that, quote, the constant stimulation provided by technology overwhelms the senses and inhibits the presence of boredom. In today's technology-based world, children rarely experience moments of downtime when their minds are free to wander and explore. So personally, I think that boredom is super important in life, and that spending time to just think is very beneficial. Now, I'm not saying anything about never watching a show or using social media again, but it's important to find a balance. Balance may mean different things for everyone, but once it's found, you're going to be the one in control of your own entertainment. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Jack.
Would you look into it all, the difference in how the TV set up in the living room versus now someone can just watch something on the computer and that structure?
I have, yes. Are you interested in like learning about that? I think it's a big, like, this is a very big topic, right? I kind of really looked into the evolution, and looking into the evolution of maybe family dynamic is something that I don't go too in depth about, but it's definitely different with like just the amount of time that is spent with family. But like I said, in my intro, like, the quality of time that's spent with them, it's definitely more of a distraction now. You know, having a box in the living room is not going to affect your outside time, right? Not like in the household, but if you're outside, now you can just pull out your phone and start watching Netflix on your phone. So it's definitely different. Casey.
You mentioned all the aspects of creativity is that sort of the company's like through TV and film, is that their goal or something to sort of get into it? Do you look into any of that at all?
So I won't be able to answer for the companies, like I'm not sure if it's their goal, but I do know that they fuel off of our attention, and the longer that they continue to stay on there is more beneficial to them, right? They're for profit. So yeah, it's like you said some of the companies. What was your question?
Is that like a goal just our companies, how one construction companies sitting around now, do they care or whatever?
Yeah, well, they don't really care. There's a lot of industries in this one that people know there's negative effects and, still do it just because it's what makes money and it's, alternate reasons. Yeah.
There's like a lot of regulations
I mean, I have been researching like, the addictive part of it, like the algorithms and stuff.